All right, y'all. Hope you had a good weekend. Today we're going to talk about something that you are probably going to come to just learn to hate, and that is the DBQ. Um, it's one of the biggest things that you're going to have to write on the exam. It's going to be something that we write a lot of throughout the year to kind of prep for that, and we're starting our first one today. But before we do that, we need to kind of have an idea of, well, what is the DBQ? What are the parts? What do I need to do to, get the points for each part? And so that's kind of what we'll be working on today. I would very, very much suggest that you are taking notes using that rubric that you have, that you should have been given, to kind of jot notes on there and kind of keep that as a cheat sheet. From this point forward, it's going to do nothing but help you. So let's go ahead and get into it. So just kind of an overview of the DBQ itself. You get 60 minutes during the test to actually write it. Now, the College Board in that 60 minutes is including a 15-minute reading time period. So let's say it takes you 15 minutes, kind of read through, take some notes maybe on your documents, and then you have 45 minutes to write it. And I think for like a standardized test, that's actually a pretty good amount of time, like to write something good. And so we're going to talk about, well, what does that look like? This is 25% of your exam score. So a good DBQ is really going to help out that exam score, is really going to help you, get that 3, get that 4, get that 5 if you do it really, really well. And so it's a big portion of your points. And then the time frame, your DBQ topics are always going to lie like from 1600 to the present. So 1600, a little bit of like an arbitrary, a random date. But think about what's kind of going on. 1600, you've got the end of the Renaissance, the Reformation is over. You've kind of got absolutism cranking up. You've got exploration that's really, cranking up. So kind of the things going on there. The present, 2001, yeah, that's kind of a random time period, but kind of gives us a good cutoff, so we know it won't be like something that happened in 2016 that we didn't really pay attention to. So we kind of know here's the cutoff where it's going to be. Now, our sample DBQ is going to be outside of that time period, and the reason being is because we've only gone through period 1, and we could probably write something from period 2 based on some knowledge, but we want to be able to go ahead and start practicing and go ahead and start seeing what these look like for us. And we'll be writing a lot throughout the year, and so this is just going to be good practice. So let's kind of look at this. This is our sample DBQ prompt. This is going to be the prompt that you're going to be addressing in your DBQ, which will be due next week. And like I said, we'll peer review, and then I will grade them. This is going to be a great day for you to kind of get an edge and use some of the ideas in here to better your DBQ and get the best possible kind of score you can, highest grade you can on this. So our DBQ prompt, without further ado, is evaluate the extent to which the invention of the printing press altered the lives of Europeans. All right, so got our prompt. Evaluate the extent. We know we're making some kind of argument. Well, let's see how we do that and how we get the points. So here's your basic rubric. That's what you have a copy of. This is actually something that another teacher made, but like literally this is not only like the exact rubric for the exam, but this gives you examples and like kind of directions that you need when you're writing it. This will be something that you become more and more and more familiar with, whether you like it or not. So let's start with that first point, the thesis point. So the thesis responds to the prompt with a historically defensible thesis or claim that it establishes a line of reasoning. The thesis must make a claim that responds to the prompt rather than merely restating or rephrasing the prompt. The thesis must consist of one or more sentences located in one place, either in the introduction or conclusion. So let's kind of break that down. Your thesis statement has to be one, historically defensible. So you have to be saying something that's true, something that you can back up with evidence. Second, you've got to use a line of reasoning, all right? And so how do we do that? How do we make sure we have an actual line of reasoning? We do that third point. We preview multiple points. So we're showing that we can develop an argument. We're providing a line of reasoning by giving multiple points. You need to have at least 2 points. 3 is best. 3 is best, and we'll talk about why. And those multiple points are just going to be the subject of your body paragraph, or of your body paragraphs. And it needs to be in the introduction or conclusion. It has to be in one of those. Write it in your introduction. To me, it just kind of doesn't make sense for it to not be in the introduction. So that's where I would say kind of make your stand, write your thesis kind of as your last 1 or 2 sentences in your introduction. Makes life a little bit easier. Let's look at a few examples of some theses. So an unacceptable thesis that doesn't do one of those or kind of any of those 4 things is this one right here. So the printing press resulted in a lot of changes in the lives of Europeans. I mean, y'all, this just doesn't tell me anything. This just doesn't say anything to me. I'm not making any sort of claim. I don't really have any line of reasoning. Well, why did it result in the changes of the lives of Europeans? I don't know. Didn't preview any points, and I mean, it just kind of falls short. It's just kind of a poor job at trying to set something up. Here's another example of an unacceptable thesis, something that you're just not going to get points for. And that is the invention of the printing press resulted in a decline in the religious belief in Europe because it allowed the widespread circulation of works of existentialist philosophy. So, one, I mean, this is making a claim, but it's just not historically defensible. It's previewing points, but again, not historically defensible. So think about this, like the printing press didn't result in the decline of religious belief. If anything, it kind of revives religious belief, and it kind of gets people more excited about religion because it kind of helps spread the Reformation, right? And we don't ever kind of see with even our humanist writing, our Christian humanist writing, people aren't like just done with the church. They're just like, hey, let's either fix it or let's move to another church. And the existentialist philosophy thing, that's just talking about the wrong time period. We'll see that that's like coming from the 1800s, not from this, time period of the printing press. And so that's just kind of not possible at all. So this one sounds a little bit better, but not going to get any points for this. Now let's look at an acceptable thesis. What gets the point? All right, what gets the point? So the printing press greatly altered the lives of Europeans because it increased literacy, made the Reformation possible, and aided the scientific revolution. All right, so we've actually got a thesis that is historically defensible. We've got points laid out, and we can see that those points are going to be 3 body paragraphs: increased literacy, Reformation, scientific revolution. Easy as that. That gets the point. That gets the point. And that can actually be, I mean, if that's kind of where you want to take your DBQ, I mean, take note of this. Take a picture real quick and, say, hey, I either want to kind of use this or I want to use something like this, or keep in mind that this is the thesis that gets the point. Well, here's a thesis that goes even further than that. This is what would be an excellent thesis. So you're adding on to what you already have. So while the invention of the printing press increased literacy and helped to bring about the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution, setting up those 3 points, right? It did not change the mindset of those Catholic Church leaders who continued to condemn those who opposed their doctrines. And so what we're going to see in this thesis is it's setting up for that complex understanding point. And we're going to talk about that later. But I mean, this kind of is taking it above and beyond. Yes, we're setting up for 3 paragraphs. We've made a claim. It's historically defensible in what we'll see, the Protestant Reformation, scientific revolution, increased literacy. But we're bringing in something else. We're bringing in kind of a new side of things as well, talking about the Catholic Church leaders. I would say what's always best is to think about your thesis as a threesis. Wow. That sounds good, right? Threesis. So with a lot of prompts, 2 points are sufficient for an acceptable thesis. You'll get the point, but I'd say always safe to make 3 arguments. It's always better safe than sorry, y'all. And what you're going to see is the documents are almost always set up in a way to where you can make 3 arguments. So you've got 7 documents. They're almost always set up in a way where you can divide it into 3 groups and say, all right, 2 documents, 2 documents, 3 documents. You'll see this one is set up in that way. To kind of divide it up in 3 different groups, all right, 3 different arguments. So always try to make 3 arguments. Always try to find the 3 groups. Find how are, these 2 documents, these 2 documents, these 3 documents similar to one another. So there's your thesis point. We've gotten 1 point. Now we got to worry about the contextualization point, all right? So contextualization describes a broader historical context relevant to the prompt. The response must relate to the topic, or relate the topic of the prompt to broader historical events, developments, or processes that occur before, during, or continue after the time frame of the question. This point is not awarded for merely a phrase or a reference. All right, so contextualization is basically setting up really useful background. Think about this, like if my reader doesn't know anything, if they know nothing, here's what they need to know to understand where I'm going with my argument, what's going on with the thesis, why am I making this argument. So it's almost like when you write an essay, you start with like something more general. You kind of start with the background and you lead into the specifics. You lead into the thesis. You lead into your argument. And I would say ideally contextualization should be the first thing in your essay. So the very, very first thing, you're setting up a background to what you're going to talk about. You're taking things that are going to be relevant to the prompt, that are going to lead the reader to the thesis. You're making sure it's something that's useful, and it's not just something that's, whatever. I'm not just, kind of throwing something in there. So it should be very first thing in your essay. That's why on this rubric, as you'll see, contextualization is actually the first thing on there. Because it's the first thing when I read your DBQ that I should see. I should see some background. I should always see it before the thesis statement. All right, so that kind of gives you some rules and makes life a little bit easier with contextualization. And here's some kind of basic rules for it. So one, no double dipping. And what I mean by that is like whatever you use as contextualization, you can't count that for any other point. So like even though it is some new evidence, you can't use that as the outside evidence point. So can't double dip. Contextualization is all by itself. You're setting up a background. Has to be and needs to be multiple sentences, y'all. don't short yourself on this one. So even if you're making like just a super long run-on sentence that makes sense, that sets up a background, that's better than just being like, well, you know, before the printing press, nobody could read. That's not good enough. That's not saying enough. It shouldn't be vague. It should always be something of substance and something that's relevant to the prompt. Kind of set yourself up for one or two details in your contextualization, so that you kind of are good, ready to go. So if you've done that, and if you've led into your thesis and written either an acceptable or an excellent thesis or a thesis, you've got 2 points. You've got 2 out of 7 points, and honestly, that places you pretty much at the average right off the bat of points on the DBQ. So 1 paragraph, 2 points, contextualization, and thesis. That's your introduction. You get 2 points right off the bat if you're setting up and then making an argument. Next thing we're going to talk about is your body paragraphs. And this is going to be your next 3 points that you're going to worry about. And that's where you're going to be using the documents. So you have 7 documents that you're given. Y'all, even though this says 3 documents, 6 documents, 3 documents, use all 7 in some way, shape, or form. So you got 3 possible points that you can score with these documents. You describe the content of 3 documents, using at least 6 documents to support your argument, and you get a point for using at least 3 documents to explain. So you're kind of doing like your HIP, you're explaining them. First, we want to look at describing, right? So what we're going to look at is actually the 3rd document from our sample DBQ. Hopefully you looked over, like I told you to, and I posted on Classroom. Hopefully you looked over these documents and kind of skimmed through. If not, well, we're doing it now. So this is the source from William Tyndale, English theologian and reformer, The Practice of Pilates. So let's read through this. 1530. They say that Peter was chief of the apostles. Verily, as Apelles was called chief of painters for his excellent cunning above others, even so Peter may be called chief of the apostles for his activity and boldness above the others. But that Peter had any authority or rule over his brethren and fellow apostles is false and contrary to the Scripture. Christ forbade it the last, even before his passion, and in diverse times before, and taught always the contrary. Thou wilt say thou canst see how there should be any good order in that kingdom, where none were better than the other, and where the superior had not a law and authority to compel the inferior with violence. The world truly can see no other way to rule than with violence, but in the kingdom of God it is contrary. The first question that arises is like, oh my goodness, how do we describe the content of this document? And what I'm going to go ahead and say is do not quote it, y'all. Don't quote it. All right, the reader has the documents. They know what the document says. If you want to score points, you want to show that you understand what the document says, right? You want to say, I don't need to quote it because I can actually describe it. I can actually say what it is saying. So when you're doing that, you want to make specific reference to the document, not quoting it, but making specific reference back to the document. Kind of the good way to do that is go ahead and mention the author by name. Say Tyndale is saying, right? William Tyndale, a Protestant reformer, is saying da 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 da, right? Don't do a drive-by reference. Don't make like a vague reference that like doesn't mention the document specifically. Be specific. Give a specific reference. It's kind of not the same as English, like where you're like, well, I don't want to be like in an English essay, maybe you're not wanting to be blunt about it. Be blunt. Be blunt, right? You want to make your reader know, like, yes, I'm bringing it up. I'm describing it right now. And finally, it needs to be clear that you have correctly interpreted the document that you're describing. So you want to have a good idea of actually what is it saying. So let's kind of look at an example of describing. How would I describe one of these documents? So William Tyndale used the scriptures to argue that the apostles were all equal and that Peter did not have any special rank like the Catholic Church claimed. All right, so easy as that. I summarized the document in one sentence. Obvious to the reader that I know and I understand what the document's saying. So I'm saying all he's saying is, Peter's equal to all the other apostles. He doesn't have any special rank, even though the Catholic Church says he does. That's it. You've described it. Let's move on. Same document. Well, we've described it. How do we use this document to support our argument that we're making? And so we have to support at least 6 documents to we have to use at least 6 documents to support our argument. And they have to very much be used purposely. And you want to make sure that you are showing, not just what a document says, but how can you actually take that, use it to support. So I've already said, okay, Peter's equal to everybody else. How do I support that or use it to support? And here's kind of an example of that. The printing press made it easier for Protestant reformers like Tyndale to publicly criticize the Catholic Church to a very wide audience. So that way you're not just focusing on the document's content, but now you're applying it to the thesis. So you're bringing in the printing press idea. So here's what it is. Well, here's what the printing press is doing with it. At least 6 documents, you're doing that, right? You're doing that with at least 6 documents. Try to do it with 7, right? Don't short yourself again. And kind of some rules to supporting or using the documents to support. Like I said, applying it to the thesis, applying it to the argument, not just saying what it is, but how does that relate to my overarching argument? And remember, a great way to kind of make sure you do that is grouping the documents. So you're already grouping them according to what you're arguing, according to your 3 points of your thesis. And it's always important, I messed up. Always important to use that topic sentence to make sure you're stating the point that you're going to argue and you're following that point that you're going to argue. So again, if you are supporting documents, go for 6. 6 is what you have to, but go for 7. Go for 1 more. And keep in mind, if you're supporting 6 documents, then you also do describe 3, or hopefully you have already described 3, or you've already described 6, honestly. Because think about, if I have to support or use a document support, I've got to say what that document is anyway, before I say, well, here's why it applies, or here's why it supports. So you want to explain what a document is. So if you're supporting using 6 documents, you honestly don't even have to worry about that describe point because you've already done that. You'll automatically earn that, which is kind of nice because you're making references back to the document. You're making it clear you know what you're talking about. So that's a kind of nice thing to have in your back pocket. And again, use all 7, right? Nobody's perfect, Hannah Montana tells us that, right? Presume and assume that you could mess up. You could, use a document wrong or interpret a document incorrectly, and it doesn't really support your argument. So use all 7 to support your argument, right? Give yourself some insurance. You're under pressure. You've got time constraints. You could mess up. What if you're like, well, I know about 6 documents, but the 7th one is really hard. Well, use all 7 just in case, right? Just in case. All right, so now for that last point when you're using the documents, it's for explaining kind of how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, audience, how or why is that relevant to an argument. So we're doing that same thing. We're going to be using HIP, so how or why is the document's historical context, intended audience, purpose, or point of view. How is that relevant to the argument that we're making? How does that kind of even support our argument further? So again, HIP. We're almost kind of like humanizing the documents when we're explaining them, because we're taking them from words on a page and showing that they're coming from a human being or they're coming from a real historical situation, and so that impacts how somebody is writing. And when you are explaining the documents, you don't have to do HIP for every single one. You just use one of those things to kind of analyze a document. So maybe I just talk about intended audience. Maybe I just talk about the historical context. And we'll kind of look at several pieces that we could do. So let's say we want to explain document 3, we want to explain the historical context. Well, we could say the Pope's claim to be the head of the Catholic Church was based on a claim that Peter was the first among the apostles and also the first bishop of Rome. That may not be something you know. It's not really immediately apparent in the document, and that's okay if you're like, well, I don't know what the historical context is, because you have intended audience, purpose, and point of view to kind of work with. So, you know, that's all right if you don't have that kind of basis and you're like, well, I know, but I don't know the specifics. It's okay, move on. Let's move on to I. Let's move on to our P's. So we're talking intended audience or purpose. Tyndale sought to use the scriptures to undermine the authority of the Pope among the general population and lead more people to embrace Protestantism. So who's his audience? Pretty much anybody. Anybody at least who can read, right? Just general population, probably middle class. And the purpose? Undermine the authority of the Pope and lead more people to embrace Protestantism. So kind of an easy little thing there. And then finally, point of view, if we wanted to explain in that way, Tyndale's writings were typical of Protestant reformers at the time, many of whom used the printing press to circulate criticism of the Catholic Church and its doctrines. This is a pretty basic thing. You're just saying Tyndale is coming from the point of view of a Protestant reformer. Well, what are the Protestant reformers, doing? Using the printing press to basically circulate their criticisms, right? To get their criticisms around, so that people know what's the Catholic Church doing wrong. So any of those things, doing any one of those, that checks off explaining one of your documents. Remember, you want to explain 4 documents, so always shoot for one more. You're required to explain 3, but explain 4 to be on the safe side, right? And I honestly would say explain any document that will allow itself to be explained. Explain as many as possible, y'all. As long as it's not counting against you on time, be thorough as possible in the hour that you have to write this thing. Overkill is always better than underkill, y'all. So got those. We should hopefully have 5 points right now. We got our points in our introduction with our contextualization, our background knowledge, our thesis, our argument, and then we got our 3 with describing, supporting, and explaining our documents. Well, now the final 2 points come in the way of outside evidence and complex understanding. So let's kind of talk about what those mean. How do we get those last 2 points? So outside evidence uses at least one additional piece of specific historical evidence beyond that found in the documents, relevant to an argument about the prompt. The response must describe the evidence and must use more than a phrase or reference. This additional piece of evidence must be different from the evidence used to earn the point for contextualization. So think about, you've already employed some outside evidence in your first paragraph, but that was only to give context. This point is for using a specific piece of evidence to very much advance and support your argument. So you're kind of showing the reader that you've got another piece of evidence to put out there, almost as though it's like another doc you just have in your back pocket. So think about your outside evidence. How do I get that point? One, I support the document. I support the argument. Going crazy here, guys. Two, I'm not using it for contextualization, so that shouldn't be a problem because contextualization is, first thing in your introductory paragraph. It's not going to be around the same place. And three, it's not found in the documents. So you might be thinking like, well, what do I do? How do I figure that out? Well, the way the exam is structured, and even the way that this DBQ is structured, there's always gaps in the evidence, y'all. There's always a few openings. There's always going to be some like kind of obvious things that you're thinking, well, why didn't they talk about this? It's so that you can talk about it. Gaps are left out on purpose. It's kind of in a way trying to make it easier for you to bring in some outside evidence, making it, so it's not an impossible task for you. If we think about our practice DBQ, things that are left out, Martin Luther, never mentioned. Galileo, never mentioned. Why not? So you can come in, you can fill in the gaps with your knowledge. Machiavelli, somebody that you can pull in. Calvin, Henry VIII, Descartes, Copernicus, Francis Bacon. There's always going to be a couple of kind of obvious groups or obvious people surrounding the topic that are kind of left out. And I can pull in any of these guys, but what I want to make sure I do is I don't want to name drop. So like, I don't want to just say, yeah, Martin Luther used the printing press too, and it was pretty cool. Like, it's not outside evidence. Like, yes, that's like true, and that helped spread his stuff, but that doesn't really show I have like a good grasp on what I'm saying. So I've got to get into how was the printing press used by this person to further their goals? How did it make a difference in Europe? How's that supporting my argument, right? You want to use multiple sentences kind of in the same way that I've said, don't short yourself. Make sure you're descriptive. Overkill is better than underkill. So not just Machiavelli wrote the Prince or Martin Luther wrote the 95 Theses, but how did that matter? For Martin Luther, the 95 Theses circulated through Europe due to the printing press. So how do I give a little bit more? Well, here are a couple examples. So first, less than a century after Jan Hus was burned at the stake, Martin Luther presented his 95 Theses, which were printed in mass quantities and circulated throughout Europe. The printing press allowed Luther's influence to spread across the continent beyond what had been possible before with failed reformers like Hus. Now, you don't have to worry about your sounding, super perfect, right? It's not a big deal. That's not, as big of a thing. But using Martin Luther, you're kind of saying, like, how did the printing press help him gain notoriety? And that ultimately kind of prevented him from being burned at the stake like other guys, like Hus before him. You have to write at least or explain at least one piece of outside evidence, but again, you might want to explain too to be on the safe side. If you're like, well, what if I didn't do enough or I didn't write enough? If you know something else, use those two pieces of outside evidence. You're going to have to use two for the LEQ anyway, so kind of might as well be consistent. It'll make it easier for you. And again, if you've got time, if you want to really score a 5 on this exam, use two outside evidences. So what's another one that we could pull in? Another example of the printing press accelerating the progress of scientific discovery can be found with Galileo being able to perform experiments based on Copernicus's theories, even though Copernicus was from Poland and Galileo was in Italy. With his telescope, Galileo proved the heliocentric theory, but he would not have known about the theory if not for the printing press. So kind of another thing, and it's outside evidence with substance is what you want to make sure you give. Not just name drop, but you want to give a little bit more. right? I want to show that I know what I'm talking about. So finally, kind of our icing on the cake point is our complex understanding point, y'all. This is like the wow point. This is the wow factor. So how do you get this point? What is it? Let's look through it. So demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. So almost how well did you make your argument? Like, was your argument successful? Let's look at the details. The response must demonstrate a complex understanding, which must be part of the argument and not merely a phrase or reference. This could include explaining nuance by analyzing multiple variables, explaining both similarity and difference, both continuity and change, or multiple causes, or both causes and effects, explaining relevant and insightful connections within and across periods, confirming the validity of an argument by corroborating multiple perspectives across themes, qualifying or modifying an argument by considering diverse or alternative views or evidence. So that's a lot of big words. What do those mean? This is basically it. So you can kind of do 5 different things to gain that complex understanding point. And what I would kind of do is decide in advance, like, how do I always want to earn this point? So every time I write a DBQ, I want to pick one of these 5 things, and I want to always do that so that I'm used to doing that, so that I know how I set that up. So 1, you can demonstrate an understanding of nuance. That's kind of like you're showing a very thorough understanding. You've been reading between the lines. You developed your argument correctly. 2, making deep historical connections. 3, putting documents in conversation, noting corroboration and contradiction. 4, connect across time and place, so connecting and explaining kind of to another time period or a different location or something else. And then 5, putting forward alternative viewpoints. So this is one that you pick one of those things, and that's what I would do. Like I said, I'd pick one of those 5, and I would always do that one for a DBQ. I would always try to do, that one thing. I'd always try to connect across time and place, or I always try to put documents in conversation. And that's actually one that we're going to talk about. I think, y'all, if you're grouping the documents, you're making them converse. You're already comparing them. You're already looking at the similarities and differences. You're already talking about how they contradict, and you're like accounting for those contradictions. So that's what I want to talk about, is that one, is putting the documents in conversation. Number 3, how would I use that to demonstrate complex understanding? So first I want to use my Tyndale document and another document. So Tyndale, right? Peter is, not higher than any of the other apostles. Here's document 5. So it's from the Council of Trent. Let's read through this real quick. The book of those heresiarchs who, after the aforesaid year, originated or revived heresies, as well as of those who have been the heads or leaders of heretics, whatever may be their name, title, or nature of their heresy, are absolutely forbidden. The books of other heretics, however, which deal professedly with religion, are absolutely condemned. Those, on the other hand, which do not deal with religion and have been, by order of the bishops and inquisitors, been examined by Catholic theologians and approved by them, are permitted. Likewise, Catholic books written by those who afterward fell into heresy, as well as by those who, after their fall, returned to the bosom of the Church, may be permitted if they have been approved by the theological faculty of a Catholic university or by the General Inquisition. So basically, this is just the Catholic Church being like, no heretical books, right? That's what the forbidden book list or the prohibited book list is talking about. So how could I get a complex understanding point? Put these documents in conversation with each other, right? So how do I do that? The Council of Trent's proclamation was aimed specifically at reformers like Tyndale, who used the printing press to challenge the church's teaching and authority, right? Council of Trent wants to condemn these heretics. Church officials hoped that by condemning works like Tyndale's, they could stop these works from being circulated and read. Because of the printing press, the church would no longer be as successful at putting down challenges as they had been before the printing press. And so these should already kind of be in our paragraph about the Reformation that we said kind of in our excellent thesis or in our acceptable thesis. So helped to bring about the Protestant Reformation, but also did not change the mindset of the Catholic Church. Well, this is showing that, and we're taking two documents to kind of show, we really understand this thing. We get this thing, right? We get this argument. We get this prompt. Now, y'all, the complex understanding point, it's easily the most difficult point for students to get. And honestly, it's not for everyone. Obviously, try for this point and set yourself up to try to do well for the point. But if you don't get it, it's okay. It's really difficult. Don't beat yourself over it. If you tried, you've tried. There's nothing else you can do. You can still pass the exam without this point. But and if you want to get a 5, makes it a lot easier if you can get every point. And if you can get this point, it's always in your best interest to get this point. So hopefully this helped kind of outline what you get your points for, what to kind of do in each situation. Hopefully you've taken good notes. Tomorrow, what we'll kind of do is start analyzing the documents. So we'll group them up, and we're going to start doing some HIP on them, and so that we can describe, use them to support, and explain them in the best way possible when we are writing this thing for ourselves. So I will see y'all on Wednesday. Have fun tomorrow. Make sure you're working hard tomorrow. And like I said, miss you guys, all right? See ya.